The train came into Harrow Bend on a Tuesday in October, and Hattie Lyle stepped down onto the platform with a carpetbag in one hand and a folded letter in the other. She had worn her second-best dress, because the best one had a torn collar she had run out of time to mend, and she had spent the last of her good thread 2 stations back, sewing up the hem of a stranger's child, a boy of 5 who had caught his coat on a seat bracket and cried harder about the tear than about the long miles. That was the whole of Hattie Lyle in one small act. She mended what she could reach. She made do with the rest. The letter had come from a matrimonial bureau in Kansas City, and she had read it so many times that the creases had gone soft as cloth. Emmett Calloway, 43 years of age, cattleman, widowed 2 years, 7 children between the ages of 4 and 16. He wanted a wife who could cook, run a household, and put some steadiness back into a home that had been living on grief and hard work since his wife Eliza was taken by fever the winter before last. Hattie was 30. She could cook. She had kept a house for 11 years before a mill accident took her husband Daniel, and, in the same wet season, the little they had managed to save. She had no children of her own, which the Bureau had written into her file as a mark against her, and which she had always carried instead as a quiet grief, not a fault. She smoothed the letter once more, though there was no need, and looked down the short, muddy platform to where 3 men stood by a wagon, watching the train the way men watch a thing they have not yet decided about. The tallest of the 3 had his hat pulled low and his arms folded across his chest, and he did not move when the others shifted. Hattie knew him from the stillness before he ever gave his name, the stillness of a man who has already made his mind up about something and is only waiting to have it confirmed. She crossed to him and set her bag down and put out her hand. Emmett Calloway took it, brief and dry. "You are smaller than the Bureau led me to expect," he said. "They weigh a woman poorly on paper," Hattie said. He looked at her a moment longer, and then he asked the thing he had ridden into town to ask, plain, the way he seemed to say everything. "Can you cook for 7 children? Not 7 grown hands. 7 children, every day, 3 times, whether the beef came in or it did not." Hattie held his eyes. "I can cook for 7, she said, "or for 70. Cooking was never going to be the hard part. The hard part is whether the 7 will let me." Something moved behind his face and was put away before it could finish. He picked up her carpetbag and carried it to the wagon without another word. The 2 men with him traded a look, and the younger one, sun-cracked and grinning, said something under his breath that she did not fully catch, though she caught the last of it. The word sparrow, offered up for the other man to laugh at. Hattie kept her chin level and climbed up onto the wagon seat as though she had not heard a thing. If this story is finding its way to your heart already, take a second to tap that like and subscribe, and tell me down in the comments what part of the world you are listening from. And if there is a woman in your own family who came out to hard country with almost nothing and made a home stand up out of it, leave her name below. I read every one of them. The ride out to the Calloway range took the better part of an hour. She sat in the bed of the wagon beside a boy of about 9 who told her his name was June, which she took a moment to understand was short for something, and who then said nothing else the whole way. The country opened around them, gold with the turned season, wide enough to make a person feel free and small in the same breath, and the mountains far off held the first snow of the year along their high shoulders. She had known the West would be large. She had not known it would be beautiful, and she had not expected the beauty to look so entirely unconcerned with whether she stayed or went. The ranch came up over a low rise, and she understood at once what the letter had meant by hard work holding a place together. The house was sound, a long timber structure with a porch running its whole front, built by a man who built things to last. But the kitchen garden had been let go to the frost without being cut back and put to bed. Through the front window, she could see a mending pile grown tall enough to topple. The porch step had a split down its middle that somebody had patched with the wrong wood and too few nails, the repair of a man with too much else on his mind. And there were children everywhere. A pair of girls hauling water two-handed from the pump. A boy hardly bigger than his axe splitting kindling with more temper than aim. And up on the porch, a girl of 16 stood with her arms folded and her weight set back on one heel in a posture so exactly her father's from the platform that Hattie nearly smiled. The eldest. She had known from the letter there would be an eldest, and she had known, without being told, most of what that would mean. The girl's name was Sadie, and Hattie had the whole of her situation within the hour. Sadie Calloway had been running that household for the better part of a year. She had cooked every meal and combed out every tangle and kept the small ones back from the creek in the dark, and she had done it without once being asked, because someone had to, because she was the oldest, because that was simply the shape the world had taken. She looked at Hattie the way Hattie had once watched Daniel bring home a paper he did not want her to read too closely, like something that would cost more than it gave. Inside, at the stove, stood the woman who kept the house on the days she came in from town, a spare, upright woman named Dorcas Pyle, who had been coming since not long after Eliza died, and who kept opinions about that kitchen filed down to the exact shelf where the salt belonged. She looked at Hattie's carpet bag, and at her worn hem, and at her small hands, and she said, "You will be the one from Kansas City." It had the shape of a charge read out in a courtroom. "I will," Hattie said. "Mrs." Pyle set her spoon across the rest. "The first Mrs. Calloway kept this kitchen a particular way," she said. "I have kept to her system since. I would expect whoever steps in to honor it." "I would expect to learn it first," Hattie said. Dorcas Pyle studied her as though braced for an argument and made uneasy by not finding one. "Supper is at 6, she said. "The stew is already on. I will show you where you will sleep." The room was the smallest in the house, a narrow space off the kitchen with a single window that gave onto the barn. On the bed lay a quilt with every seam run straight and every square matched true, Eliza's work by the plain look of it, and on a nail behind the door hung an apron, also Eliza's, that nobody in that house had worn or taken down. Hattie set her carpet bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and let the sounds of the house move around her. 7 children and a man who watched her like a tool he was not sure would hold. A housekeeper with a boarder to defend. A girl of 16 who had already handed down her verdict. She was not discouraged. She had buried Daniel and survived 2 years of boarding house rooms and the particular smallness of having to answer a marriage advertisement at 30 because every other door had closed. This was a door that had opened. She meant to walk through it the right way. She unpacked with care, the way she did everything. She hung her one good dress at once. She set her Bible on the little shelf. She laid her sewing roll on the windowsill, where the morning light would reach it. And last, she took out her grandmother's receipt book, its cover gone soft as a glove, and its pages held in a square of oilcloth for want of a spine, and she set it where she could see it from the bed. Her grandmother had pressed that book into her hands the week she married Daniel, and had said, close and certain, "Cook like you mean to stay, girl, and a house will make room for you." Hattie had fed people as though she meant to stay for 16 years. She saw no reason to stop now that it counted most. Supper that first night was the stew Dorcas Pyle had left on, thin and heavy with salt, set out with bread a day old and gone dense. Hattie said nothing. She ate what was in front of her and watched the children eat and marked which of them left food untouched and which cleaned the plate too fast. The fast of a child who has learned not to trust that there will be more. The youngest, a girl of 4 named Fern, fell asleep sitting up before she had finished, a bitten crust loose in her fingers, and not one of the others seemed the least surprised by it. Hattie reached over and took the crust before it could drop to the floor. Across the table, Emmett Calloway watched her do it and said nothing at all, but he watched. After, while Dorcas washed up and the older ones herded the small ones toward bed, Hattie stood a few minutes alone in the kitchen and took a quiet accounting of it. She looked into the flour bin and the salt crock and turned the dried beans over in her hand. She found a jar of the summer's tomatoes shoved to the back of a high shelf behind a sack of cornmeal, and a little dried sage and thyme, small amounts but enough to matter, and she found that the big cast-iron skillet had not been given a proper seasoning in a long while, and had begun to show rust along one lip. She made a note of it in the part of her mind that kept such notes. Then she went to bed while the house went quiet, and lay listening to the wind come down cold off the mountains, and thought about what she would put in front of them in the morning. She was up before the house. That was the first thing, and, in the end, half of everything. The kitchen was black and cold when she lit the lamp, and she worked inside its small ring of light with the economy of a woman who had cooked her whole life in spaces too small for her ambitions. She fed the stove first. Then she took down the rusting skillet, worked her own lard into it from a tin she had carried wrapped at the bottom of her bag, and set it low on the heat to take a skin. She woke the sourdough she had found half forgotten behind the flour, still alive though gone flat and sad, fed it, set a measure aside to rise, and worked the rest into a dough her grandmother had first put under her hands when she was 8 years old, the heel of her palm pushing and folding until the feel of it told her it was right, and no clock could have told her better. The children came down one at a time, pulled out of sleep by the smell before they were properly awake. First Asa still hitching his suspenders, then 2 middle girls with their braids half loose from the pillow, then the 14-year-old Isaac, who stopped in the doorway at the sight of a strange woman at his mother's stove and could not decide whether to come in. And then Fern came down the stairs sideways, both small feet to each step, and walked straight across the room to stand at Hattie's hip without a word, watching the biscuits come out of the oven the way a small child watches a thing she has already decided is important. Hattie set a plate down in the middle of the table. Biscuits with pan gravy off the salt pork she had found in the cold box. Eggs scrambled soft with sage crumbled between her palms to wake the oil in it. A pot of cornmeal cooked slow with dried apples stirred through and sweetened with the last dark spoon of honey. And the children ate. They ate in the way that told her the whole of the last long year without a word being said. Not wolfish, they had manners, but steady, attentive, the way children eat when what is in front of them is better than what they had grown used to expecting. Sadie came down last of all. She looked at the table. She looked at Hattie, and she sat and ate and said nothing. Emmett came in from the barn near 7 and stood in the doorway and took in the plate, and the children bent over it, and Fern with her chair pushed close against Hattie's. He poured his own coffee. He took a biscuit and ate it standing at the counter, and Hattie did not look at him, and he did not look at her, and that was how the first morning passed between them. If you have made it this far onto the porch with us, do this quiet story a kindness and hit subscribe and ring the bell, because stories like this one only carry as far as you are willing to pass them along. And if you have ever walked into a room that did not want you and stayed until it did, tell me about it below. Dorcas Pyle arrived at her usual 9 on her usual days and came in through the back with the ease of a woman who has never once had to knock. She stopped just inside the door. She took in the skillet hanging seasoned and black on its hook, the work table scrubbed pale, the sourdough risen high in a clean crock with a cloth laid over it, and she looked at all of it the way a person looks at a room that has been moved around while they were out of it. "I kept a system," she said. "I know," Hattie said. "I have been learning it. That starter belonged in the back corner. It keeps cooler there. It was close to dead, Hattie said, and did not say the rest, only that it had wanted warmth and feeding, and had got them. Dorcas Pyle's mouth pressed flat. She tied on her apron and took up a station at the sink, and began to wash things that had no need of washing. Later, with Emmett gone to the calving sheds and the children at their letters in the front room, Sadie drilling them off the primer with the worn patience of a girl who had done it too many mornings, Dorcas said, low and easy, as if remarking on the weather. The last one they brought out did not last 3 weeks. Hattie went on rolling the crust under her pin, and did not slow. I am not the last one, she said. Dorcas Pyle made a small sound that was not agreement. The town women came on the 3rd day, 2 of them, the wives of men whose names Hattie did not yet know, arriving in a good wagon with a covered dish and the bright attention of women who have driven out to look at something new. Mrs. Aldous did the talking. She was pleasant in the face and sharp in the eye, and she looked at Hattie the way one woman looks at another she has already sorted and shelved. We did hear Emmett Calloway had settled on someone at last, she said, setting her dish on the table without waiting to be asked. We wanted to be first to welcome you. That is kind, Hattie said. The second woman gave her name as Mrs. Spear and had the careful voice of a person choosing each word for what it would do later. It is a long way from Kansas City, Mrs. Aldous said, traveling alone, and no children of your own. It was not put as a question. No, Hattie said. 7 is a great many for a woman who has never raised even one, Mrs. Aldous said, tilting her head as if in sympathy. Eliza had her hands full of them, and Eliza was a big, hearty woman, strong as a gate. She let that lie where it fell. Hattie was slight. Hattie was small. Hattie had come from a bureau because no nearer door had opened. Mrs. Aldous did not say any of it. She did not need to. Well, she said, rising, we do hope it takes, for the children's sake. They stayed an hour. They ate the pie Hattie had baked that morning and allowed that it was very good, which it was, and looked about the kitchen and allowed that it was coming along tidy, which was also true. And when they climbed back into their wagon, they spoke to one another in the low voices women use for things meant to be half heard, and the word that carried back to Hattie at the window was temporary. Sadie caught it too. Hattie knew by the way the girl's chin came up as the wagon rolled out of the yard. That night, on the stairs, herding the 2 smallest up to wash, Sadie said, not to Hattie, not to anyone in particular, only to the air she was walking into, don't any of you get attached. Cooks come and cooks go. She said it the way she said most things, level and sure. The voice of a girl who had taught herself hard not to want anything that had shown it could leave. Hattie sat at the table with a shirt across her knee and a needle in it, and did not look up and did not answer. What she thought about instead was the night before, when Fern had padded down in her nightgown long after the house should have been still, and, saying nothing, climbed onto the bench at Hattie's side and leaned there. Hattie had gone on with the mending, and, after a while, had started to talk, the low, aimless way you talk to a small child who has come looking for you in the dark, naming each garment as she took it up, and whose it was, and one true kind thing she had already noticed about that child. Fern had gone to sleep against her arm inside of 20 minutes, and Hattie had carried her up one careful tread at a time, and drawn Eliza's straight-seamed quilt up under the small chin, and stood a moment looking down at a child who had no memory left of her own mother, and had come downstairs in the night to find the new woman at the kitchen table. It was Asa who came for her on the 4th night, the 12-year-old, who had said next to nothing to her since she stepped off the train, and who watched her from doorways with the wariness of a boy who had already learned that things you counted on could be taken. He knocked on her door near 10. When she opened it, he said, "Abel's burning up." Abel was 6, the second youngest of the boys, and she had marked him at supper, the way he had pushed his food in a slow circle, and the wet shine that had come up behind his eyes. She had thought about saying a word then, and had chosen to wait and watch. She did not wait now. She went down the hall behind the boy to the room the brothers shared and laid the back of her hand to Abel's forehead, and the heat that came up into her palm was the kind that asked for doing, not watching. She had known a fever like it before. Her grandmother had shown her, hands over hands, what a fever like it wanted. She turned to Asa and kept her voice flat and unhurried on purpose. "Steady now," she said. "Bring me a basin of cool water and clean cloths, and do not wake your father just yet." Then she stopped, because the boy was looking at her with a face she knew from her own glass. Fear got up in the clothes of calm. "He will come right," she said, "but I need that water now." Asa went. She pulled the chair to the bedside and sat close and laid her hand flat on the blanket over the child's chest and said, "Lo, I have got you." Abel's eyes came half open and settled on her without quite finding her, and then closed. Down the hall, a door opened. Emmett Calloway was in the doorway, inside the minute, still in his day clothes, a man who slept the way men sleep, who run cattle, never all the way under, always keeping one ear on the dark. He looked at his son, small and flushed against the pillow. He looked at Hattie, already wringing out the first cloth over the basin Asa had run in with, already at the work and clearly knowing why. And for one moment, the man who had looked at her on the platform like a post, he doubted looked at her another way, entire. Not gratitude, something that came before gratitude, the front edge of a question he had not known he had. "How bad?" he said. It was hardly a question, more a man setting his feet. "Bad enough that we sit up through the night with it," Hattie said. "Not so bad we cannot bring it down." She had learned that difference from her grandmother, who had learned it from hers. 3 generations of women in a family where the doctor was always farther off than the trouble. She laid the cool cloth over Abel's brow and folded it to the colder side and pressed it to his neck and wrists, where the blood runs near the surface. "I will want willow bark," she said, not looking away from the boy, "and yarrow, if the frost left any standing." "I will look," Asa said, and was already gone. Emmett brought the willow himself, a length he had stripped off the woodpile with his knife in the dark, and Asa came back with a fist of dried yarrow from a bundle Hattie had found overlooked in the kitchen rafters. She set a small pot over the lamp flame in the corner, the stove too far to leave the child, and made a weak tea, weak on purpose, easy on a small stomach. A scrape of the last honey stirred through it. She coaxed 2 spoons of it into him between the cloths, and kept the cloth turning cool, and talked, not about anything that mattered, only the steady sound of a voice in the dark, a field of blue flax she had passed somewhere in Kansas that made the ground look like a piece of fallen sky, a gray station cat that rode the eastbound to the water stop and came home every evening on the westbound like a man keeping regular hours. She talked and cooled and waited, because waiting was its own medicine, and her grandmother had taught her that too. Emmett drew the second chair in some time past midnight and did not announce it, only sat. Asa fell asleep across the foot of his own bed, with one boot still on. The house held its breath around the 3 of them, and the fever neither climbed nor broke, but held its ground. And Hattie was not troubled by that, because she knew this kind, the kind that argues a long while before it gives in. For a long time, Emmett said nothing. Then he said, "Where did you learn all this?" "My grandmother," Hattie said, and turned the cloth. She knew what grew and what each green thing was good for. When I was small, I believed every woman knew it. I understood later she had chosen to learn it, because where we lived, there was no one else who would. Emmett was quiet again. The lamp laid its soft light across the boy's face, and the wild edge had begun to come off the heat. "Eliza went of a fever," he said. Hattie did not tell him she was sorry, because the word had been spent on him too many times already, and he had no use for another one. "I know," she said instead. "That is why you are sitting in that chair." It was not a reproach, and she did not say it as one. She said it the plain way you say a true thing to a person who is at last ready to hear it. Emmett looked at his son, and looked at her, and said nothing more, and stayed. At 3 in the morning, the fever broke. It went the way they go when they lose the argument all at once, and quietly, the child's skin turning from dry and scorching to damp and cooling under her hand, the breath lengthening and evening out, the small body letting down the tension it had carried for hours. Hattie felt it give beneath her palm, and felt something in her own chest let down with it. She traded the cloth for a dry one, and drew the blanket up, and looked at the boy sleeping now, the way a body sleeps, that is only sleeping. She looked at Emmett, who was watching her with a face she did not try to read. "He should sleep the day through," she said. "Broth when he wakes, nothing heavier." She gathered the basin and the cloths and carried them out. She was at the kitchen pump when Sadie came to the doorway. The girl had come down without a sound, and stood there in her nightgown, with her arms hanging at her sides, instead of folded across her, which was itself a different thing. And her face was different too, cracked open in a way the daylight hours had never once let show. "Is he all right?" Sadie said, and the level sureness had gone clean out of her voice. She was 16 years old, and she was afraid. "He is sleeping," Hattie said. "The fever broke a little while ago. He will be tired and hungry come morning, and nothing worse." Sadie stood where she was. Hattie wrung the cloths and hung them over the basin's edge, and drew clean water, and made nothing at all of the girl standing in the dark, offered no comfort that had not been asked for, only let her be there without it having to mean a thing yet. After a while, very low, Sadie said, "I didn't think it would work, the bark and all of it. Mrs. Pyle only ever does the cool cloth and prayers over it. Both have their uses," Hattie said. Sadie almost smiled. She went back up the stairs, and Hattie stood alone in the dark kitchen and listened to the ranch breathe its slow, cold breath outside the walls, and thought how a thing can turn by degrees so small you only see the whole of the turn later, when you look back to where you started from. By morning, all 7 of them knew. The way word travels through any house where children share beds and thin walls. When Abel came down near 9, pale and careful on his feet, with Asa at one elbow and Isaac at the other, the kitchen was already full. Fern climbed onto the bench and pressed in close to where Hattie stood at the stove, and announced to the whole room, with the flat authority of a 4-year-old, stating a settled fact, that Hattie had fixed Abel. Asa looked at Hattie and gave her a single nod, the kind that costs a boy of 12-something to give. She set a bowl of soft cornmeal in front of Abel and sat down beside him while he ate and said nothing, and the other children watched, and the house felt changed in a way not one of them could have named, and every one of them could feel. Dorcas Pyle came in at 9:30 and walked into a kitchen that had rearranged itself around another woman while she slept. She saw it in the first breath, the sick boy at the table eating when by her lights he ought to have been upstairs under a cold cloth and a prayer. She looked at Hattie, and then at Emmett leaning against the counter with his coffee, and something in the set of him told her mouth the whole of what it had been about to say. She did not say it. She tied on her apron and began, for the first time, to help without being asked, and that was its own kind of answer. Sadie came to her after the noon meal. She found Hattie in the small room off the kitchen, working down the mending pile with the same steady patience she carried to all of it, and she stood in the doorway the way Asa used to stand in doorways, and she said, I was rude to you." Hattie looked up. "You were guarding your family," she said. "That is not the same thing as rude." Sadie's jaw worked. "I told the little ones not to get attached." "I heard you," Hattie said, and tied off her stitch and cut the thread clean. "I would have said the very same at 16, after what this house had been through." The girl came in then and sat in the chair across from her, and they stayed a while together without saying a great deal, and Hattie showed her the double stitch her grandmother had used on a shirt shoulder that had to hold a working man's weight, and Sadie watched and tried it and had it very nearly right on the first go, which told Hattie a useful thing about the girl that she meant to hold on to. Emmett found her at dusk in the kitchen garden, pulling the last of the dead growth up before the hard freeze could set it into the ground for good. He stood at the edge of the beds with his hands in his coat pockets. He had come out with words ready, the ones about the arrangement and his expectations, and whether the whole thing would suit, and he had been adding to them for 4 days. He looked at her kneeling in the cold turned dirt, with her breath clouding in the last light and her worn gloves gone dark at the fingertips, and the words he had readied would not come up out of him. What came instead was one word, and it was simpler and truer than everything he had prepared. "Stay," he said. Hattie sat back on her heels and looked up at him. One word, short and whole, and without a hedge on it, the way a man talks when he has quit managing himself and is only telling the truth of a thing. She thought about the boarding house rooms, and the bureau, and the platform at Harrow Bend, and the way he had looked at her there, like a post he wasn't sure of. She thought about Abel sleeping the fever off with color coming back into his cheeks, and Fern pressed warm against her arm at breakfast, and Sadie's hands on the mending learning a stitch built to last. "I am already staying," she said. Not to correct him, only to name the true shape of it. Emmett stood there a moment longer. Then he nodded once, the way the men in that family nodded when a thing had been decided, and he went back toward the barn, and Hattie went back to the garden, and the last of the October light came down flat and gold across the mountains, and across the Calloway place, and across a woman on her knees in the cold dirt who had come out with a worn carpet bag and her grandmother's book and 7 children's worth of patience, and had earned every inch of the ground she was kneeling on. She made bread that night after the supper things were cleared, and let the loaves rise slow on the warm shelf at the back of the stove, while the house came down around her toward sleep, the particular music of a full house going quiet. Boots dropped on the boards overhead. A latch, somebody's low voice easing a child up out of a bad dream, and back down into rest. She worked the dough by lamplight and did not hurry it, because the bread would be ready when it was ready, and not a minute sooner, and some things will not be pushed. They had called her a sparrow on the platform, small and brown, and easy to pass over, and she thought, folding the dough, that a sparrow was a bird that stayed the winter when the bright ones flew, that built quiet in the eaves of a house and held on through the cold. She thought about her grandmother's words the week she married, "Cook like you mean to stay, and a house will make room for you." And she looked around the kitchen that was becoming hers by slow degrees, and she thought the old woman had been right, had always been right, and that the room to stand in had been here the whole time, waiting only for someone with steadiness enough to walk through the door and mean it. Thank you for staying with this one all the way to the last word. If it moved something in you, the next story is already waiting on your screen, so go and let it in. And if you have not yet, subscribe and pull up a chair on the porch, because we are here telling the stories of the women who carried far more than the world ever stopped to notice.